gave a different list of people behind, responsible for the American Revolution. I mean, John Adams himself, when he was asked 200 years ago, who's responsible for American independence, he gave a list of names that we don't study today. The list of names he gave were all Christians and many were ministers of the gospel. He said, well, if you want to know who's behind American independence, right up top you have to have the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. Of course, there's the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. You have the Reverend George Whitefield, the Reverend Charles Chauncey. I mean, the chances that we know who these guys are today, maybe Whitefield, but the other three, we know nearly nothing about them. And yet John Adams points to them as being behind independence. We don't know much about folks like Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Moran or Lemuel Haynes or all these other guys that we used to know about. Now, it's interesting, and at Wall Builders, we have a collection of writings. We own 70,000 writings from before 1812. So I own thousands of the Founding Fathers' handwritten documents, the guys who did the Declaration, Constitution, etc. And I was just recently going through some newspapers from the American Revolution, and in those newspapers, the British press was complaining about what they called the Black Regiment. And the Black Regiment was their term for preachers, because all the preachers back then wore black robes. Catholic, Protestant, didn't matter. Everybody wore a black robe. The Black Regiment is what they blamed for stirring up the revolution. It's the ones they blamed for America separating from Great Britain. As a matter of fact, you'll find that they targeted clergy during the American Revolution. You see, in the American Revolution, we're coming up on Memorial Day, where we honor those who have given their lives for the nation. We had 25,000 individuals die in the American Revolution, and at that time, the nation was only 3 million people total. So that's like having 25,000 die out of the city of Houston. I mean, that's a massive number, percentage-wise. And in that group, you'll find that prisoners of war were really treated poorly. There were 10,000 more soldiers that lost their lives to prisoner of war camps than to British bullets. So you're much safer being shot at with live ammunition than you are being in a prisoner of war camp. And you will find that in the prisoner of war camps, the highest mortality rate was among ministers of the gospel. When the British caught a preacher, they were treated worst of all because they blamed them for what went on in the American Revolution. Now, having said that, I mean, when you look at the Declaration of Independence, which announced our birth, it's interesting that the 27 clauses there, and by the way, we don't study the 27 clauses today in school anymore. The one we do study is clause number 17, taxation without representation. Most people don't know what the other 26 are. The one we study wasn't even in the top half of what concerned them. Nevertheless, you'll find that those 27 clauses in the Declaration, every one of them had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. So really, the Declaration of Independence is nothing more than a listing of what we've been hearing in sermons for the last 30 to 40 years in America. And that's why John Adams and others could point to preachers as being really behind what went on in American independence. Now, we've kind of moved away from that today, but it's striking that when you go back to those documents and look at the role, now I'm just talking about preachers, and there's a ton of folks that were involved that were men of faith, strong Christian believers. The Judeo-Christian ethic was really strong. We had a lot of Jewish individuals involved. But you look just at the signers of the Declaration. These 56 guys right here that did the National Birth Certificate, 29 of the 56 held seminary or Bible school degrees. Half of those guys are ministers. We don't have a clue who they are today. We wouldn't know folks like the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon or Charles Thompson. We wouldn't know folks like Thomas McKean or John Dickinson. You know, all these other names that we don't even know today. Half those guys are preachers of the gospel. You get into those who did the Constitution, you'll find that 44 of those involved in ratifying the U.S. Constitution were ministers of the gospel. So from start to finish, ministers were very involved in this. People of faith were very involved in our form of government. And that's why George Washington would, and by the way, you take Washington, who certainly is the father of the country. I mean, when you look at the Constitution that they produced, Washington heading the Constitutional Convention, you look at the document they gave us, that document has ideas that had never before appeared in any written government document. Before these guys did it, you can't find a written government document that has separation of powers, or checks and balances, or full republicanism, which is Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. It's just not there before you see them do it. So a fair question is, where did they get these novel ideas? Political science professors from the University of Houston said, you know, if we can read the writings of the Founding Era, see who's quoted in those writings, we'll know where they got their ideas. So they took 15,000 writings out of the Founding Era. They read through those writings, found 3,154 direct quotes. They took every quote back to its original source and found that far and away the most frequently cited source in the American founding was the Bible. 34% of all quotes came out of the Bible. You'll find from the writings of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, they point to Jeremiah 17:9 as the basis of separation of powers. You'll also find the three branches of government, Isaiah 33:22. You find tax exemptions to churches in Ezra 7:24. So many things they gave us 200 years ago came right out of those scriptural concepts. And that's why George Washington, after 45 years of leading the nation through war and through political service, when he retired, his final farewell address that he gave, by the way, I brought an original document with me. This is from 1796. This is Washington's original farewell address. That's his from 1796. And in this address, he summed up for Americans what it was that had made us different from other nations and what we needed to do to stay on track. And by the way, even at the time he was president, France had already gone through 3 revolutions just while he was president. It was already obvious to us that we had something different from other nations, and he knew what it was. And this is what he said in his farewell address. He said, of all the habits and dispositions that lead to political prosperity, that is, if you want your politics to prosper, he said religion and morality are indispensable supports. Now, according to Washington, the thing that makes our politics prosper in America is religion and morality. Matter of fact, he was so adamant about that that the next sentence he said was this: in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. His viewpoint was, if you try to take religion and morality out of public policy, out of public life, out of politics, I'm not going to let you call yourself a patriot. Now, that's a pretty strong litmus test, but I'm going to assume he knows what a patriot looks like. I mean, he led them through the American Revolution. He is one himself. And his view of patriotism was, if you undermine religion and morality in America, American politics, American policy, you can't call yourself a true patriot. Now, that's what we used to teach in schools, and that's what we used to know. And strikingly, Patrick Henry echoed the same truth. Patrick Henry, great political leader, great military leader, governor of Virginia, the general in the American Revolution. Patrick Henry, with all this political experience, this is what he said. He said, the great pillars of all government are religion, or virtue, morality, and religion. He said, this is the armor, my friend, that this alone that renders us invincible. Patrick Henry, great military leader, said, you know, it's not just how strong our military is, it's how strong our virtue, morality, and religion is that makes our government strong. He continued, he says, righteousness alone can exalt America as a nation. Reader, whoever thou art, remember this, and in thy sphere practice virtue thyself and encourage it in others. His thing was, righteousness exalts a nation, that's what makes America strong. That's nothing more than a quotation of Proverbs 14:34, one of the most frequently quoted Bible verses I've seen by political leaders in the American founding. Proverbs 14:34 stresses that righteousness does exalt a nation. Now, righteousness represents the type of policies you have in a nation. God-fearing, God-honoring type of policies God can bless. But how do you get God-honoring, God-fearing type of policies in public life? Proverbs 29:2 answers that question. It says, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. So you got to have God-fearing leaders to get God-honoring policies. You're not going to get God-honoring policies from folks who despise God or His principles. I mean, quite frankly, if I can take the Bible and make it into an American election, if you want righteousness to exalt a nation, you don't elect Ahab and Jezebel and Rehoboam and Jeroboam and all the other guys. And if you want righteousness to exalt a nation, you go elect Daniel, or you elect Joseph, or you elect Moses, or you elect Nehemiah. You elect some of those guys. That's the only way you get righteousness to exalt a nation, is to have the right kind of leaders. And in America, neither the righteous nor the wicked rule. Neither one of them rule without us putting them there. I mean, we're the ones that choose our leaders, which goes back to elections. And strikingly, when you look at Christian participation in election over recent elections, let me take you back to Christian voting patterns. Between 1992 and 1996, there was a 17% drop in Christian voter turnout. Between 1996 and 2000, there was an additional 23% drop in Christian voter turnout. Now, in 4 elections, we have dropped 40%. You see, if people with these values don't elect others to office for those values, don't get it in policy. I mean, quite frankly, to use an abortion issue, you're not going to get pro-abortion people to elect pro-life people to office. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to get anti-God people to elect pro-God people. It won't happen. So we've had a real drop here in these traditional values of voters, which means you're going to see a real drop in leaders who hold those values and in policies that reflect those values. And by the way, as Christians, we're not a small group in America. As a matter of fact, there are 3 groups of Christians, what are called Christian voters, born-again Christian voters, and evangelical Christian voters. And evangelical is the smallest group of Christian voters in America. They're the ones that by polling are defined to be very serious about their faith. They're Christians who say they pray, read the Bible, and go to church at least once a week. And you'll find that in America, we have 60 million evangelicals in America. 60 million that are really serious about their faith, and yet in 2000 election, only 15 million voted. And that's 1 out of 4. You can imagine what the political and cultural landscape would look like if these folks just voted their values, so that's 45 million. Among those 60 million evangelicals, 24 million are identified as not being registered to vote. It's 40% of that group. And so if you look at a simple admonition that Jesus gives in Matthew 5 to be salt and light, essentially 24 million have said, not me, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be salt and light in civil affairs. So we've taken ourselves very much out of the process. That's why in 2002 you heard so much on media and airways, Christian airways, about Christians, get registered to vote, go vote your values. Every Christian leader you can think of was on the airwaves saying that. I myself was on over 1,100 stations prior to the election of 2002 saying, Christians, go register, go vote your values. So with all this effort of people trying to get Christians to vote and vote their values, what was the effect? Or was there an effect? Well, there was. We actually saw an increase in Christian voter turnout in 2002 of 2%. Not just a whole lot for all the effort that went into it, but you got to remember, we've been losing 10% a cycle for 4 straight cycles. We've recovered that 10%, we're up to, that's really a 12% turnaround off the trend of the previous 4 elections. So that's not bad. Well, did that little bitty upturn have any effect at all? Yes. How do we know? We looked at exit polling. Exit polling is what's done when you go vote. The day you vote, there'll be people meet you outside the polls. Who'd you vote for? Why'd you vote? And that's how we know what the top issues are in an election. It usually takes several weeks before you get the accurate results back from exit polling, and now they've gone into voter news service and kind of does it for all the media groups. But nonetheless, it takes a few weeks to get everything back. Having said that, one of the values issues that we can look at, and we would expect people of biblical values to support those values when they vote, is the abortion issue. That's the one that's been there for 30 years. That's the one that they poll on in exit polling. Now, in recent years, other values have popped up. They've started in the last 2 or 3 elections asking people about the marriage issue. So there's other things. But the one that's been there the longest has been the abortion issue. And it's interesting that when you look at the 2002 elections, how much impact did the abortion issue have? You find that in that election, 41% of all voters said, I voted the way that I did because of the abortion issue. Now, it's divided down into 23% who said I voted a straight pro-life ticket and 16% who said I voted a straight pro-abortion ticket. But notice that does provide a 7-point advantage for a pro-life candidate. Now, when a pro-life candidate runs in a federal election, that has not been an advantage in recent elections. Now, you could do that in my state of Texas. You could do that across the Southeast. You can do that in the Midwest. But you run as a pro-life candidate in Illinois or Pennsylvania or Ohio or Nevada or New Mexico, that's not an advantage. That'll get you in trouble in those states. But now suddenly, if you were a national candidate, federal candidate running on pro-life, you suddenly had a 7-point advantage with just the upturn that we had of 2% or actually 12% in Christian voter turnout. The result of that election was these 54 freshmen that were elected to Congress. These are the 54 freshmen we sent to Congress in 2002, and out of the 54, 36 are pro-life, which is a 2/3 pro-life class, which is really good in a single election. I mean, literally, anything over 50.1% is progress, but we got 2/3 in one shot. In that year's election in the Senate, we sent 10 freshman senators to the U.S. Senate. Out of the 10, 8 were pro-family, pro-faith, pro-life senators. 80% in one class in the Senate. That's really good, because the Senate is where we've needed the most help on these kind of issues. So that was 2002. Well, 2004 election rolls around. There's still a big effort to get Christians to go vote their values, and we saw a 93% increase in Christian voter turnout in 2004. It went from 15 million up to 28.9 million. Now, I'll point out to you that's still less than half that are voting, but that's still a whole lot better than where it was just 2 elections earlier. So we're up to nearly half now. And we saw that have an impact as well. For example, if you look at the life issue in the voting, instead of 41% saying I voted the way I did because of abortion, it's up to 42%. Instead of 23% saying I voted a straight pro-life ticket, it was 25%. And instead of 16% saying I voted straight pro-abortion, it was down to 13%. Now look at that. That's a differential of 12 points. Now it's getting easier to elect people with those values to office. When people with those values show up and vote, it's easier to elect people who reflect those values to office. So we see that. The result of that election is this freshman class in 2004. There were 40 freshmen sent to the U.S. House in 2004. Out of the 40, 25 were pro-life, still a 2/3 class. And when you look at the Senate that year, in the Senate that year, we had 9 new freshman U.S. senators. Out of the 9, 7 of the 9 were pro-life, pro-faith, pro-family. So in a 2-year cycle, we have seen 19 freshman senators added, 15 of them were pro-family, pro-faith, pro-life. That's a 77% class, which is really good stuff, especially in the U.S. Senate. So with that composition, what do you expect the policy to be? I mean, it makes sense that when you elect someone with your values, you're going to see policy that reflects that. If that's environmental, if that's tax, if that's military defense, whatever your values are, if you get someone who holds your values, you expect to see it come out in policy legislation. Do you know that since Roe v. Wade in 1973, Congress had not passed any law to limit the jurisdiction of abortion prior to those two elections. They'd always dealt with money. We had the Hyde Amendment that says you can't use federal funds for abortions. Passed that every year. Every year we would beat back the Sanchez Amendment, where Sanchez says we need to spend money for abortions on a military basis. We said, no, we don't. Beat that back. Every year you go through the Mexico City policy, which says, well, you're not going to use State Department funds for abortions over. We did money all the time, but we didn't do anything to limit the jurisdiction of abortion until those two classes got there in 2002, 2004. They passed not the first major anti-abortion law, but the first 4 major anti-abortion laws, all been signed into law by the President. You had, for example, the Infant Born Alive Protection Act, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, the Partial Birth Abortion Ban, and the Fetal Farming Ban. All 4 from those two classes. Now, we hadn't had it before that. We suddenly get that. See, that's the impact of people voting and voting their values. We see a change in positive. You didn't hear about this stuff on the news. That's not real important on the news to a lot of news folks, but it is important for values voters, and that's something that happened out of this. As a matter of fact, had it not been for Christian voters showing up and voting their values in those 2 elections, we would not have the 2 new justices sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court that we have. The reason we picked up those additional 15 votes to be able to confirm somebody that was a solid, strict constructionist rather than a living document kind of person was those 2 elections. That gave the numbers in the Senate to be able to do that. Now, judges have become a very important issue. I mean, that's been a focus. It rightly should be a focus. In the last 2 elections, for some weird reason, the National Party decided in 2006 that judges shouldn't be a national issue, so they shut up about it. But in 2004, 2002, it had been an issue, and it was a big issue, because when you look at recent national polling, you have recent national polling with it 77% of the nation thinks that judges have gone too far in taking religion out of public life. Matter of fact, 59% of the nation think that judges have singled out Christianity for attack. Now, that's a significant poll. I mean, name me something else that 77% of the nation agrees on. There's just not much out there that you can get 77% of the nation to agree on, and yet they agree that judges have gone too far in taking religion out of public life. Well, when you see that kind of stuff, you say, we need to deal with judicial activism, and it sounds like we're starting a new crusade. See, this is one of the difficulties about not knowing our own documents, not knowing the 27 clauses that are here. You know, out of the 27 clauses that led to the founding of America, the 27 grievances they listed, 4 of them dealt with judicial abuses. 4 of the 27 clauses said, you know, we're tired of British judges making policy. We think we'll start our own nation where the judges can't make policy. I mean, 4 of the clauses dealt with judicial activism, judicial abuses even back then. That was a big issue to them. And as I mentioned, what we had in the judges back then, yeah, judges then and now, that's not a new issue. But as I mentioned, what we have in the Declaration had been preached in the pulpit before it was in the Declaration. That's why it's not surprising to go back and find that we had lots of sermons that dealt with judges, judicial issues. And why not? There's a ton of Bible verses dealing with judicial issues. I think what I consider to be the most significant Bible verse addressing the issues of judiciary is Isaiah 1:26. Isaiah 1:26, you remember the story of Isaiah, God's prophet. He said, I'm going to send you to the nation, and the nation's going to get restored. And man, what a job he had. The king at that time was Manasseh, probably the most wicked king in Judah's history. The nation's all upside down, and he says, Isaiah, we're going to turn this thing over. And God says, here's how we're going to do it. He says, I'll give you judges as at the beginning and lawyers as at the first. In other words, God says, we're going to get the nation turned right side up, and the way we're going to do it, I'm going to give you judges like you used to have, lawyers like we had at the beginning. He says, then. And that's a big word. In other words, if you get the right kind of judges and lawyers, then what is the result? God says, then you'll be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. And I find it significant that God ties the righteousness of a political entity, of a city or a nation or whatever, to the judges and attorneys in that area. But then again, it makes sense. If you believe from a Judeo-Christian perspective, from the biblical perspective, that righteousness exalts a nation, God-honoring policies, you look at so many policies we have that are not God-honoring, and you know what? They didn't come from legislators. They came from judges. Matter of fact, Roe v. Wade has never been passed by never a single legislature has passed abortion on demand. We have it as a national policy because the judges said it's our policy. It's striking that right now today, in recent polling, only 24% of the nation still supports abortion on demand, abortion with no restrictions. Only 24%, but that's our national policy until this recent decision where they did take out partial birth abortion, said that's off the table. So we've got a judicially enacted policy. Same thing with prayer football games. 82% of the nation supports prayer at athletic events. And yet the judges have said, oh, you can't have prayer football games. Supreme Court, Jane Doe versus Santa Fe Independent School District, 1995, court took it off the table. People want it. We've never had a legislature who said you can't have prayer football games. See, so much of our policy comes from judges and not from legislators. That's why if you get the right kind of judges, the nation gets turned right side up. It goes right back to the people, and the people have a great set of values out there. We keep winning on those values and polling numbers. Marriage, 72% of the nation thinks marriage should be between a man and a woman. You know, I go through all the other numbers. A huge win on cultural numbers. Just big numbers out there. So this is why judges were so significant. Now, you may not realize it, but when President Bush had the opportunity to nominate justices to the Supreme Court, he actually nominated 3 justices in a period of 64 days. 64 days, 3 justices, and nobody's done that since George Washington. Well, there's a lot of Bible verses that would have been applicable at that time. For example, when he nominated Justice Roberts, why not? Let's look at 2 Chronicles 19, verses 6 and 7. Judges, take heed to what you're doing, for you do not judge for man, but for the Lord who is with you in judgment. Therefore, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. In other words, let's have God-honoring, God-fearing judges. Good idea. We also had the second nomination, that of Harriet Miers. She later withdrew her name, but she was the first evangelical nominated to the Supreme Court in over 70 years. How about something like Psalms 2, verses 10 and 12? It says, be instructed, you judges of the earth, serve the Lord with fear. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and his wrath be kindled against you. Judges, listen up. Be God-honoring, honor the Father and the Son, otherwise you're going to get really ticked off. If you get them really ticked off, we're all going to suffer. See, that was the thing, lest his wrath be kindled against you. This is the kind of sermons we've had in those previous years because we had so much Bible verses on it. Finally, the President nominated Samuel Alito. How about something like Ezra 7:25? Appoint judges who know the laws of God. Just basic God-honoring kind of policies. So we've had that go through in judges. And by the way, these 2 guys have already made a significant impact on the court. And if you don't know, the composition of the court right now is we have 4 justices, including these 2, who actually read the U.S. Constitution. We've got 4 justices who read the Constitution of every other nation, and we got 1 justice who can't figure out what Constitution he wants to read. So we've got 4 good guys, 4 bad guys, and a switch right in the middle. So we've got 4 solid, and these are 2 of the 4 justices. And having said that, with these 2 new guys in the court, which is more solid justices than we've had in the last 15 years on the court, with these 2 new guys in the court, they've already rendered 2 major pro-life decisions from the Supreme Court. First major pro-life decisions we've had since Roe v. Wade. We've had a lot of cases at the court on abortion, but we're not winning the cases, or we've won 2 of them now. These guys have also refused to hear any case that has challenged marriage. We had a challenge against DOMA that came to the court. They said, no, we're leaving that alone. It's staying just the way it was. Federal law is good. We've also had these guys for the first time in 27 years. They looked at a set of the 10 Commandments and said, it's okay to display things like don't kill and don't steal in public. That's not a bad idea. So we got the 10 Commandments up. The Perry versus Van Orden case in Texas they upheld. Do you know, since that decision 18 months ago, we have not lost a 10 Commandments decision in the nation in 18 months. I mean, things are starting to change in the culture. And we don't hear this much in the news, but it's starting to change in the culture. You say, wow, this is really good to get 2 justices. And you know, to get so many pro-life laws in there, that's really good. How do we do that? Because we had champions that went to bat and fought for those things. And one of those champions was Sam Brownback. He was right. Did you know that Sam was chairman of the subcommittee on the judiciary over the Constitution, subcommittee on the Constitution? That's where all those judges go, is right through the Judiciary Committee. He's chairman over that subcommittee on the Constitution, which I think is the most important subcommittee in the entire Judiciary Committee because it deals with the Constitution. Well, guess who got to be over that stuff? Sam. So here come these judges. He champions them through. You know, even those pro-life, like the fetal farming ban, I mean, that was a signature issue for Sam in the Senate. That was something he came up with way ahead of the curve. He's been pushing these things for years and years. Something else that got signed into law last year that hardly anybody's heard about is the Broadcast Decency Act. Now, the Broadcast Decency Act, pretty interesting. You remember the Super Bowl a few years ago where you had the wardrobe malfunction, you know, with Timberlake and Jackson. Well, you know, that wardrobe malfunction, because of the way the law was, it only cost a few $1,000s for the network to do that. Well, when you're getting $2 million for a 60-second commercial, what's a few $1,000s? That's just the cost of doing business. No big deal. Same with Howard Stern's on network TV. You know, you get fined for stuff, but the fines were so small. Sam got that raised to such a level. Anybody notice that Stearns has not been on network TV in the last 4 months? He's completely gone. See, networks can't afford anymore to have indecency on broadcasting. You got to go pay for Stearns. Now, that's fine. You want to, you pay for it. It's on satellite. but it's no longer on broadcast television where the kids get a hold of it. And that's had a huge impact even on the programming that's coming out of Hollywood and Los Angeles and New York, because now the consequences are so high if you have indecency that you don't want to mess around and get close to that line. It's already changed the culture in significantly positive ways. We just haven't heard anything about that. We also had the Mount Soledad cross. This is a Veterans Memorial. Man, the ACLU has gone after Veterans Memorials like crazy, because so many Veterans Memorials have crosses in them, which if you've been through a time of war, you know how important your chaplains were, you know how important faith in God was, and this is a real comfort for those guys who lost friends, who come back, who see a symbol of hope in the future, that I get to see these guys again. And ACLU wants to secularize all these Veterans Memorials. So this one in California, 29-foot high cross on top of Mount Soledad there outside of San Diego. Federal judge said ACLU is right, get that cross down, even though it's been there for 50 years since the Korean War, get rid of the cross, and if you don't, I'm going to charge you $5,000 a day fine until you get that cross down. Well, get a hold of the federal Congress, they pass, and Sam, right through the Senate, helps get this thing done, the Mount Soledad Act, you know, and the legal effect of this act is it essentially told the federal judge to go jump in the Pacific Ocean because the cross is going to stay. You know, do you know what the fastest growing form of addiction in America is? It's internet gambling. And yet, you didn't hear that last year we got passed, before the Democrats took over, we got passed a ban on it. You cannot gamble on the internet anymore. It is gone. It's over. It's done with. That fastest form of addiction is now gone. You know, Sam's right behind that. We haven't heard anything about that act. You also have the issue of chaplains in the military. Back in August of '05, there was a lawsuit filed by a guy against the Air Force Academy saying, oh, these chaplains at the Air Force Academy are trying to cram Christianity down every cadet's throat. They're trying to turn this into a Christian institution. Well, the Air Force got so scared of the Pentagon that they came out with new regulations for chaplains that says you guys can't pray anymore in most settings. We're taking prayer away from you. By the way, if you do pray, you can't use the word Jesus in your prayer. And we want you to do peer-to-peer stuff. Since you're an officer, you can talk to other officers, but we don't want you messing with these enlisted guys. I mean, they just completely emasculated the chaplain corps. Well, the IG goes in and says, there's nothing going on wrong with the academy. Actually, the federal judge threw the lawsuit out and said this didn't happen at the academy, but the Air Force had overreacted and created a bad set of regs. And so we had chaplains actually in theater action over in Iraq, like the 10th Mountain Division, being disciplined simply for performing their duties in Iraq, losing their chaplaincies, being sent home and being disciplined. And so what happens? They go to bat on this, and in December they got signed into law a provision that throws all that stuff out, gives chaplains the same freedom they had for 230 years. It completely opens up the military again to be able to connect with God at times of battle, which they want to do. I mean, that's a high service rate in the military. All this stuff happened, and Sam's been right in the middle of this stuff. I mean, this is the stuff that he's been doing for years and years and years. Now, Sam's been in Congress since 1994 election, was in the House 2 years, then went to the Senate, and has been in the Senate since then. But that means he's amassed a whole lot of votes over that period of time. Any given session of Congress, there will be between 10 and 13,000 bills each session of Congress. There will be hundreds of votes each session of Congress. We usually only hear about 6 or 7 on TV over any course of time. There's hundreds. And there's groups out there that track how Congressman does on military issues, on taxation issues, on whatever the issue is. And with faith and values, there's a lot of groups that track that as well. And Sam's got a long record. You know, he has over 4,500 record votes, so that you know exactly what he believes and stuff. And you'll find that, for example, those groups that monitor faith and family issues, or those groups that monitor conservative issues, or even constitutional issues, conservative issues. The Conservative Coalition, you have here literally the American Conservative Union that for a lifetime gives him a 94% rating. In 4,500 votes, they say he has voted at 94%. That's an A. That's good over the course of the whole thing, especially in the Senate where there's so much pressure to do the wrong thing in the Senate. Then you have folks like the NRA, National Rifle Association. Over his course of all 4,500 votes, he gets an A. And then you have folks like Eagle Forum. Eagle Forum looks at a lot of the United Nations issues, international issues, etc. 89% for Sam from Eagle Forum. You look at groups like Family Research Council, 100%. Christian Coalition, 100%. National Right to Life, 100%. I mean, there's voting records out there that show Sam is not a recent convert to these conservative things. He's been there all the way through from start to finish ever since he got into Congress. And you know, you can judge somebody not just by their friends, and we know that's one of the ways you can judge individuals by the friends they have, but you can also judge somebody by their enemies. And there's groups on the other side of all these issues that oppose what's happened, and Sam just doesn't seem to do very well.
That's don't do well.
They don't like him very much. Great example, National Education Association gives him an F, which is really good news. If you got an A from those guys, then you're not that And you know, I don't think he's on the Christmas card list for the ACLU. They don't tend to like him very much. And the socialists really don't like him. Americans for Democratic Action, that's a socialist group in America. I mean, only 7% from the socialist. He's not a good socialist. See, that means he's free market, free enterprise, the very things that have made America great that we've incorporated from the very beginning. He's not on the socialist side of having the government be your nanny kind of stuff. That's a life record. That's really good stuff. And by the way, don't think I'm saying that as a pejorative, because we know the scriptures tell us that we're to take care of the orphans, the widows, that those in affliction, we're to visit those in prison, we're to take care of the hungry. That's not the issue. That issue is to be taken care of. That is biblical, it's scriptural, but it's interesting that the Pilgrims came to America under a form of socialism, and we know from their writings that they came up with the free enterprise system. And they attribute the free enterprise system to 1 Timothy 5:8 to 2 Thessalonians 3:10. So the free enterprise system really is a very biblical system. Socialism is not a good system. Read Proverbs 1 and 2, and you see a very clear condemnation of socialism. So this is a clear distinction between approaches of government, philosophies of government. You also see that there's a lot of other groups that don't like Sam. Homosexual activists definitely don't like him. They give him a 0 for their rating of Planned Parenthood does not like him. He gets a 0 for that. Same with NARAL, pro-abortion. I mean, poor Sam, he hadn't voted right on one time on their issues. That's good stuff. And both friends and enemies agree that he is conservative, that he defends Judeo-Christian values. And so, now having said that, let me go back and finish up on elections for just a little bit, because I was telling you what happened between 92 and 2000, that we had this 40% drop of that period of time. In 2002, we saw a little upturn of 2%, and then in 2004, we saw a big upturn of 93%, and then we come to last year's election, 2006. What happened last year? We had a 30% drop in Christian voter turnout. We went from 28.9 million down to 20.5 million. 8.4 million fewer evangelicals voted. Now, the result of that election was seen in the freshman class. We have 54 new freshmen in the House. Of the 54 new freshmen, only 17 are pro-life, which is a 31% pro-life class. That is such a difference from what it had been in the previous two groups. And by the way, what type of policy do you think you're going to get out of that group right there? Probably not many good ones. You see, in the previous 10 years, we've had over 170 pro-life votes in Congress. What's going to happen now is not only can we not get a standalone pro-life bill in Congress even heard this session, all of our votes are not going to be pro-life, they're going to be pro-abortion, so we're going to have to be fighting against everything. This is a defensive session because literally Christians did not show up and vote their values in the last election. 8.4 million fewer Christians. Now in the Senate, we had 10 new freshman senators come in. Only 2 of the 10 are pro-life. And of the 2 of the 10, only 1 of the 10 is pro-marriage. Only 1 of the 10 senators we elected to the Senate this time is for marriage. It's between a man and a woman. Only 2 are pro-life. Not good news in the Senate. What kind of judges are we going to get out of that body? Not just Supreme Court justices, but also the ones that sit in the Federal District Court and Federal Court of Appeals. So this is a big issue. As a matter of fact, the Baltimore Sun looked back at it, and the Baltimore Sun said very simply that in their analysis, this is the most pro-choice Congress in the history of the Republic. We've never had a Congress this pro-abortion. Now, that brings us to the elections that are coming up already now. We're in election campaign season. The 2000 elections are there. And what direction are we going to take in the 2008 elections? Because I guarantee you, there is a ton of cultural issues that will be decided in the presidential election and the 2008 elections. No question about it. President, the next president, whoever he is going to get to a point about 1/4 of the judiciary. Anywhere from 18 to 23% usually is what a president will appoint over a 4-year cycle. So you're going to have, in this next election cycle, you're going to have candidates running for president, and somebody is going to appoint that 5th justice one way or the other. We've got a squish in the middle. We've got 4 bad, 4 good. Which way are we going? Because I've got a friend who argues cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. He said one of the justices just came to him and said he's getting ready to retire. And it's one of the justices on the far left that's getting ready to retire. So are we going to replace it with a younger far left justice? Are we going to replace it with a squishy justice in the middle who doesn't know what he believes? Or are we going to replace it with a conservative strict construction? That's what's at stake in this next 2008 election. plus all the judges down under that. So not only the issue of judges, but we've also got the issue of religious expressions. We've also got the issue of abortion. We've also got the issue of marriage. These are all big things that are up in this next election. And that's why Sam running at this time is such a good thing, because he's got a track record. He's a proven, valued person on all these issues. And by the way, there is a great statement that was given in 1803 by the Reverend Matthias Burnett. This is one of these famous preachers from back in the American founding. He was giving a sermon to the Connecticut legislature, which sounds really strange today, but we used to do that for 170 years. We opened state legislative sessions with a sermon from a minister. And so he was talking to the House, the Senate, the Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and he finished talking to all of them, and then he turned up to the gallery to all the citizens sitting up there who had elected all these guys down on the floor. And this is what he told the citizens. He said, to God and posterity, you're accountable for your rights and your rulers. Now, in America today, we'd have a lot of folks say, not me, I'm not accountable for my rulers. I didn't even vote last election. Exactly. That is the point. When we don't vote, we get the kind of rulers like we have right now, the most pro-abortion Congress in the history of the Republic. See, we are accountable to God. He gives us a vote. He says, what'd you do with that vote? Now, too many Christians only vote once in an election. And don't think I'm encouraging voter fraud. What I mean is this. They only like to go vote in the general election in November of election year. Well, if you wait to vote only in November, oftentimes your choice is between the bad and the worst. If you don't go vote in the primary and get the good guys out and move them into November, you don't have good choices in November. A lot of Christians say, well, I don't want to get involved in parties. I'm not partisan. You got to get involved in a party if you want the good guys to advance and be there in November. You guys still in Iowa have not yet decided when your caucus is going to be. But whenever your caucus is going to be, you need to grab friends and drag them with you to the caucus to make sure the good guy advances out of the caucus. Because you've got somebody who's already proven himself in these values. So back to Matthias Burnett, he says, let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers delivered to you. So we've had a blessed nation with blessed institutions for 231 years, but that doesn't mean it will last for 260 years or 270 years. It has to be renewed every generation. The only way you renew it from generation to generation is people who have the understanding of what makes us unique, preserving those principles that make us unique. And that's why it's so easy to talk about Sam. It's so easy to promote him. And by the way, one of the things, I held political office in Texas for 9 years. One of the things I learned early on in legislature and recruiting people for office and voting for people for office is that you want to elect people you don't have to lobby. If you have to lobby them after they get there, if you have to lobby them on your values, you've already lost the battle. You want somebody in there that you don't have to convince them to get a good strict instructions, justice, and court. You want somebody in there that you don't have to convince them that marriage between a man and a woman is right. See, you want to elect someone you don't have to lobby. That's the only way you make political progress. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you someone that you will not have to lobby on the issues of faith and family in so many ways. Sam, come on, brother.